UrantianArtist here. Welcome to the podcast on my UrantianArtist channel. Welcome to episode 16, titled Walking on the Beach with Jesus. Let me start in paper 192, Appearances in Galilee, Visiting with the Apostles 2 and 2. About 6 o'clock, Friday morning, April 21st, the Urantia master made his 13th appearance, the first in Galilee, to the 10 apostles as their boat drew near the shore close to the usual landing place at Bethsaida. Callie, thank you for joining us on this podcast. Would you please start us out?
UrantianArtist, thank you for having me. In paper 192, it says, Jesus visited with the 10 apostles and John Mark for more than an hour, and then he walked up and down the beach, talking with them 2 and 2, but not the same couples he had at first set out together to teach. All 11 of the apostles had come down from Jerusalem together, but Simon Zelotes grew more and more despondent as they drew near Galilee, so that when they reached Bethsaida, he forsook his brethren and returned home. Before taking leave of them this morning, Jesus directed that 2 of the apostles should volunteer to go to Simon Zelotes and bring him back that very day, and Peter and Andrew did so.
When they had finished breakfast, and while the others sat by the fire, Jesus beckoned to Peter and to John that they should come with him for a stroll on the beach. As they walked along, Jesus said to John, "John, do you love me?" And when John answered, "Yes, Master, with all my heart," the Master said, "Then, John, give up your intolerance and learn to love men as I have loved you. Devote your life to proving that love is the greatest thing in the world. It is the love of God that impels men to seek salvation. Love is the ancestor of all spiritual goodness, the essence of the true and the beautiful." Jesus then turned towards Peter and asked, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter answered, "Lord, you know I love you with all my soul." Then said Jesus, "If you love me, Peter, feed my lambs. Do not neglect to minister to the weak, the poor, and the young. Preach the gospel without fear or favor. Remember always that God is no respecter of persons. Serve your fellow men even as I have served you. Forgive your fellow mortals even as I have forgiven you. Let experience teach you the value of meditation and the power of intelligent reflection." After they had walked along a little farther, the Master turned to Peter and asked, "Peter, do you really love me?" And then said Simon, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And again said Jesus, "Then take good care of my sheep. Be a good and true shepherd to the flock. Betray not their confidence in you. Be not taken by surprise at the enemy's hand. Be on guard at all times. Watch and pray." When they had gone a few steps farther, Jesus turned to Peter and for the 3rd time asked, "Peter, do you truly love me?" And then Peter, being slightly grieved at the Master's seeming distrust of him, said with considerable feeling, "Lord, you know all things, and therefore do you know that I really and truly love you." Then said Jesus, "Feed my sheep. Do not forsake the flock. Be an example and an inspiration to all your fellow shepherds. Love the flock as I have loved you, and devote yourselves to their welfare, even as I have devoted my life to your welfare, and follow after me even to the end. Peter took this last statement literally, that he should continue to follow after him. And turning to Jesus, he pointed to John, asking, "If I follow on after you, what shall this man do?" And then, perceiving that Peter had misunderstood his words, Jesus said, "Peter, be not concerned about what your brethren shall do. If I will that John should tarry after you are gone, even till I come back, that is what is that to you? Only make sure that you follow me." This remark spread among the brethren and was received as a statement by Jesus to the effect that John would not die before the Master returned, as many thought and hoped, to establish the kingdom in power and glory. It was this interpretation of what Jesus said that had much to do with getting Simon Zelotes back into service and keeping him at work.
When they returned to the others, Jesus went for a walk and talk with Andrew and James. When they had gone a short distance, Jesus said to Andrew, "Andrew, do you trust me?" And when the former chief of apostles heard Jesus ask such a question, he stood still and answered, "Yes, Master, of a certainty I trust you, and you know that I do." Then said Jesus, "Andrew, if you trust me, trust your brethren more, even Peter. I once trusted you with the leadership of your brethren. Now must you trust others as I leave you to go to the Father. When your brethren begin to scatter abroad because of bitter persecutions, be considerate and wise counselor to James, my brother in the flesh, when they put heavy burdens upon him which he is not qualified by experience to bear. And then go on trusting, for I will not fail you. When you are through on earth, you shall come to me." Then Jesus turned to James, asking, "James, do you trust me?" And of course James replied, "Yes, Master, I trust you with all my heart." Then said Jesus, "James, if you trust me more, you will be less impatient with your brethren. If you will trust me, it will help you to be kind to the brotherhood of believers. Learn to weigh the consequences of your sayings and your doings. Remember that the reaping is in accordance with the sowing. Pray for tranquility of spirit and cultivate patience. These graces, with living faith, shall sustain you when the hour comes to drink the cup of sacrifice. But never be dismayed. When you are through on earth, you shall also come to be with me."
Jesus next talked with Thomas and Nathanael. Said he to Thomas, "Thomas, do you serve me?" And Thomas replied, "Yes, Lord, I serve you now and always." Then said Jesus, "If you would serve me, serve my brethren in the flesh, even as I have served you. And be not weary in this well-doing, but persevere as one who has been ordained by God for this service of love. When you have finished your service with me on earth, you shall serve with me in glory. Thomas, you must cease doubting. You must grow in faith and the knowledge of truth. Believe in God like a child, but cease to act so childish. Have courage, be strong in faith, and mighty in the kingdom of God." Then said the Master to Nathanael, "Nathanael, do you serve me?" And the apostle answered, "Yes, Master, with an undivided affection." Then said Jesus, If, therefore, you serve me with a whole heart, make sure that you are devoted to the welfare of my brethren on earth with tireless affection. Admix friendship with your counsel, and love to your philosophy. Serve your fellow men even as I have served you. Be faithful to men as I have watched over you. Be less critical. Expect less of some men, and thereby lessen the extent of your disappointment. And when the work down here is over, you shall serve with me on high.
After this, the master talked with Matthew and Philip. To Philip he said, Philip, do you obey me? Philip answered, Yes, Lord, I will obey you, even with my life. Then said Jesus, If you would obey me, then go into the lands of the Gentiles and proclaim this gospel. The prophets have told you that to obey is better than to sacrifice. By faith have you become a God-knowing kingdom son. There is but one law to obey, and that is the command to go forth proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. Cease to fear men. Be unafraid to preach the good news of eternal life to your fellows who languish in darkness and hunger for the light of truth. No more, Philip, shall you busy yourself with money and goods. You now are free to preach the glad tidings, just as are your brethren. And I will go before you and be with you even to the end. And then, speaking to Matthew, the master asked, Matthew, do you have it in your heart to obey me? Matthew answered, Yes, Lord, I am fully dedicated to doing your will. Then said the master, Matthew, if you would obey me, go forth to teach all peoples this gospel of the kingdom. No longer will you serve your brethren the material things of life. Henceforth, you are also to proclaim the good news of spiritual salvation. From now on, have an eye single only to obeying your commission, to preach this gospel of the Father's kingdom. As I have done the Father's will on earth, so shall you fulfill the divine commission. Remember, both Jew and Gentile are your brethren. Fear no man when you proclaim the saving truths of the gospel of the kingdom of heaven. And where I go, you shall presently come.
Then he walked and talked with the Alphaeus twins, James and Judas, and speaking to both of them, he asked, James and Judas, do you believe in me? And when they both answered, Yes, Master, we do believe, he said, I will soon leave you. You see that I have already left you in the flesh. I tarry only a short time in this form before I go to my Father. You believe in me. You are my apostles, and you always will be. Go on believing and remembering your association with me when I am gone. And after you have, perchance, returned to the work you used to do before you came to live with me, never allow a change in your outward work to influence your allegiance. Have faith in God to the end of your days on earth. Never forget that when you are a faithful son of God, all upright work of the realm is sacred. Nothing which a son of God does can be common. Do your work, therefore, from this time on as for God. And when you are through on this world, I have another and better worlds where you shall likewise work for me. And in all of this work, on this world and on other worlds, I will work with you, and my spirit shall dwell within you. It was almost 10 o'clock when Jesus returned from his visit with the Alphaeus twins, and as he left the apostles, he said, Farewell until I meet you all on the mount of your ordination tomorrow at noontime. When he had thus spoken, he vanished from their sight. After each Urantia visit with the apostles, Callie and I will share a couple paragraphs about the 11 apostles, that you may know what they did as apostles and how they died so valiantly. Andrew. Very soon after Jesus' ascension on high, Andrew began the writing of a personal record of many of the sayings and doings of his departed master. After Andrew's death, other copies of this private record were made and circulated freely among the early teachers of the Christian church. These informal notes of Andrew's were subsequently edited, amended, altered, and added to until they made up a fairly consecutive narrative of the Master's life on earth. The last of these few altered and amended copies were destroyed by fire at Alexandria about 100 years after the original was written by the first chosen of the 12 apostles. When the latter persecutions finally scattered the apostles from Jerusalem, Andrew journeyed through Armenia, Asia Minor, and Macedonia, and after bringing many thousands into the kingdom, was finally apprehended and crucified in Patria in Achaia. It was 2 full days before this robust man expired on the cross, and throughout these tragic hours he continued effectively to proclaim the glad tidings of the salvation of the kingdom of heaven. Peter, after his rash denials of the Master, he found himself, and with Andrew's sympathetic and understanding guidance, he again led the way back to the fish nets, while the apostles tarried to find out what was to happen after the crucifixion. When he was fully assured that Jesus had forgiven him, and he knew he had been received back into the Master's fold, the fires of the kingdom burned so brightly within his soul that he became a great and saving light to thousands who sat in darkness. Peter's wife was a very able woman. For years she labored acceptably as a member of the women's corps, and when Peter was driven out of Jerusalem, she accompanied him upon all his journeys to the churches as well as on all his missionary excursions. And the day her illustrious husband yielded up his life, she was thrown to the wild beasts in the arena at Rome. And so this man Peter, an intimate of Jesus, one of the inner circle, went forth from Jerusalem, proclaiming the glad tidings of the kingdom with power and glory until the fullness of his ministry had been accomplished, and he regarded himself as a recipient of high honors when his captors informed him that he must die as his master had died on the cross, and thus was Simon Peter crucified in Rome. James Zebedee. James lived his life to the full, and when the end came, he bore himself with such grace and fortitude that even his accuser and informer, who attended his trial and execution, was so touched that he rushed away from the scene of James's death to join himself to the disciples of Jesus. John Zebedee. When he became an apostle, John was 24 years old, was the youngest of the 12. He was unmarried and lived with his parents at Bethsaida. He was a fisherman and worked with his brother James in partnership with Andrew and Peter. Both before and after becoming an apostle, John functioned as the personal agent of Jesus in dealing with the Master's family, and he continued to bear this responsibility as long as Mary, the mother of Jesus, lived. And at Ephesus, when the aged bishop was no longer able to stand in the pulpit and preach, but had to be carried to church in a chair, and when, at the close of the service, he was asked to say a few words to the believers, for years his only utterance was, "My little children, love one another." John had a cool and daring courage, which few of the other apostles possessed. He was the one apostle who followed right along with Jesus the night of his arrest and dared to accompany his master into the very jaws of death. He was present and near at hand right up to the last earthly hour, and was found faithfully carrying out his trust with regard to Jesus' mother, and ready to receive such additional instructions as might be given during the last moments of the Master's mortal existence. One thing is certain, John was thoroughly dependable. John usually sat on Jesus' right hand when the 12 were at meat. He was the first of the 12 really and fully to believe in the resurrection, and he was the first to recognize the Master when he came to them on the seashore after his resurrection. When in temporary exile on Patmos, John wrote the book of Revelation, which you now have in greatly abridged and distorted form. This book of Revelation contains the surviving fragments of a great revelation, large portions of which were lost, other portions of which were removed subsequent to John's writing. It is preserved in only fragmentary and adulterated form. John traveled much, labored incessantly, and after becoming bishop of the Asian churches, settled down at Ephesus. He directed his associate Nathan in the writing of the so-called Gospel according to John at Ephesus when he was 99 years old. Of all the 12 apostles, John Zebedee eventually became the outstanding theologian. He died a natural death at Ephesus in AD 103 when he was 101 years of age.
Philip went on through the trying times of the Master's death, participated in the reorganization of the 12, and was the first to go forth to win souls for the kingdom outside the immediate Jewish ranks, being most successful in his work for the Samaritans and in all subsequent labors in behalf of the gospel. Philip's wife, who was an efficient member of the women's corps, became actively associated with her husband in his evangelistic work after their flight from Jerusalem persecutions. His wife was a fearless woman. She stood at the foot of Philip's cross, encouraging him to proclaim the glad tidings even to his murderers. And when his strength failed, she began the recital of the story of salvation by faith in Jesus, and was silenced only when the irate Jews rushed upon her and stoned her to death. Their eldest daughter, Leah, continued their work, later on becoming the renowned prophetess of Hierapolis. Philip, the one-time steward of the 12, was a mighty man in the kingdom, winning souls wherever he went, and he was finally crucified for his faith and buried at Hierapolis. Nathanael. Nathanael, the sixth and last of the apostles to be chosen by the Master himself, was brought to Jesus by his friend Philip. He had been associated in several business enterprises with Philip, and with him was on the way down to see John the Baptist when they encountered Jesus. In many respects, Nathanael was the odd genius of the 12. He was the apostolic philosopher and dreamer, but he was a very practical sort of dreamer. He alternated between seasons of profound philosophy and periods of rare and droll humor. When in the proper mood, he was probably the best storyteller among the 12. Jesus greatly enjoyed hearing Nathanael discourse on things both serious and frivolous. Nathanael progressively took Jesus and the kingdom more seriously, but never did he take himself seriously. Nathanael's father, Bartholomew, died shortly after Pentecost, after which this apostle went into Mesopotamia and India, proclaiming the glad tidings of the kingdom and baptizing believers. His brethren never knew what became of their one-time philosopher, poet, and humorist, but he also was a great man in the kingdom, and did much to spread his master's teachings. Even though he did not participate in the organization of the subsequent Christian church, Nathanael died in India.
Matthew Levi. Matthew, the seventh apostle, was chosen by Andrew. Matthew belonged to a family of tax gatherers or publicans, but was himself a customs collector in Capernaum, where he lived. He was 31 years of age and married and had 4 children. He was a man of moderate wealth, the only one of any means belonging to the apostolic corps. He was a good businessman, a good social mixer, and was gifted with the ability to make friends and to get along smoothly with a great variety of people. He was one of the apostles who made extensive notes on the sayings of Jesus, and these notes were used as the basis of Isidora's subsequent narrative of the sayings and doings of Jesus, which has become known as the Gospel according to Matthew. When the funds for the week were short of the estimated requirements, Levi would often draw heavily upon his own personal resources. Also, sometimes when he became greatly interested in Jesus' teaching, he preferred to remain and hear the instructions, even though he knew he must personally make up for his failure to solicit the necessary funds. But Levi did so wish that Jesus might know that much of the money came from his pocket. He little realized that the Master knew all about it. The apostles all died without knowing that Matthew was their benefactor to such an extent that when he went forth to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom after the beginning of the persecutions, he was practically penniless. When these persecutions caused the believers to forsake Jerusalem, Matthew journeyed north, preaching the gospel of the kingdom and baptizing believers. He was lost to the knowledge of his former apostolic associates, but on he went, preaching and baptizing through Syria, Cappadocia, Galatia, Bithynia, and Thrace. And it was in Thrace at Lysimachia that certain unbelieving Jews conspired with the Roman soldiers to encompass his death. And this regenerated publican died triumphantly in the faith of a salvation he had so surely learned from the teachings of the Master during his recent sojourn on earth. Thomas. Thomas was the 8th apostle, and he was chosen by Philip. In latter times, he had become known as Doubting Thomas, but his fellow apostles hardly looked upon him as a chronic doubter. True, this was a logical, skeptical type of mind, but he had a form of courageous loyalty which forbade those who knew him intimately to regard him as a trifling skeptic. When Thomas joined the apostles, he was 29 years old, was married, and had 4 children. But the better his associates knew Thomas, the more they liked him. They found he was superbly honest and unflinchingly loyal. He was perfectly sincere and unquestionably truthful, but he was a natural-born fault-finder and had grown up to become a real pessimist. His analytical mind had become cursed with suspicion. He was rapidly losing faith in his fellow men when he became associated with the 12, and thus came in contact with the noble character of Jesus. This association with the Master began at once to transform Thomas's whole disposition and to effect great changes in his mental reactions to his fellow men. Jesus enjoyed Thomas very much and had many long personal talks with him. His presence among the apostles was a great comfort to all honest doubters and encouraged many troubled minds to come into the kingdom, even if they could not wholly understand everything about the spiritual and philosophic phases of the teachings of Jesus. Thomas's membership in the 12 was a standing declaration that Jesus loved even honest doubters. Thomas is the great example of a human being who has doubts, faces them, and wins. He had a great mind. He was no carping critic. He was a logical thinker. He was the acid test of Jesus and his fellow apostles. If Jesus and his work had not been genuine, it could not have held a man like Thomas from the start to the finish. He had a keen and sure sense of fact. At the first appearance of fraud or deception, Thomas would have forsaken them all. Scientists may not fully understand all about Jesus and his work on earth, but there lived and worked with the Master and his human associates a man whose mind was that of a true scientist, Thomas Didymus, and he believed in Jesus of Nazareth. Thomas had a trying time during the days of the trial and crucifixion. He was for a season in the depths of despair, but he rallied his courage, stuck to the apostles, and was present with them to welcome Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. For a while he succumbed to his doubting depression, but eventually rallied his faith and courage. He gave wise counsel to the apostles after Pentecost, and when persecution scattered the believers, went to Cyprus, Crete, the North African coast, and Sicily, preaching the glad tidings of the kingdom and baptizing believers. And Thomas continued preaching and baptizing until he was apprehended by the agents of the Roman government and was put to death in Malta. Just a few weeks before his death, he had begun the writings of the life and teachings of Jesus.
James and Judas Alphaeus. James and Judas, the sons of Alphaeus, the twin fishermen living near Charissa, were the 9th and 10th apostles, and were chosen by James and John Zebedee. They were 26 years old and married, James having 3 children, Judas 2. These 2 men were almost identical in personal appearance, mental characteristics, and extent of spiritual perception. What may be said of one should be recorded of the other. Andrew assigned them to the work policing the multitudes. They were the chief ushers of the preaching hours, and in fact the general servants and errand boys of the 12. They helped Philip with the supplies. They carried money to the families for Nathanael, and always were they ready to lend a helping hand to any one of the apostles. James and Judas, who were also called Thaddeus and Lebbaeus, had neither strong points nor weak points. The nicknames given them by the disciples were good-natured designations of mediocrity. They were the least of all the apostles. They knew it, and felt cheerful about it. The twins were good-natured, simple-minded helpers, and everybody loved them. Jesus welcomed these young men of one talent to positions of honor on his personal staff in the kingdom, because they were untold millions of other such simple and fear-ridden souls on the worlds of space, whom he likewise wishes to welcome into the active and believing fellowship with himself and his outpoured Spirit of truth. Jesus does not look down upon littleness, only upon evil and sin. James and Judas were little, but they were also faithful. They were simple and ignorant, but they were also big-hearted, kind, and generous. The twins served faithfully until the end, until the dark days of trial, crucifixion, and despair. They never lost their heart, faith in Jesus, and save John, they were the first to believe in his resurrection, but they could not comprehend the establishment of the kingdom. Soon after their master was crucified, they returned to their families and nets. Their work was done. They had not the ability to go on to the more complex battles of the kingdom, but they lived and died conscious of having been honored and blessed with 4 years of close and personal association with the Son of God, the sovereign maker of a universe.
Simon Zelotes. Simon Zelotes, the 11th apostle, was chosen by Simon Peter. He was an able man of good ancestry and lived with his family at Capernaum. He was 28 years old when he became attached to the apostles. He was a fiery agitator, was also a man who spoke much without thinking. He had been a merchant in Capernaum before he turned his entire attention to the patriotic organization of the Zealots. Simon Zelotes was given charge of the diversions and relaxation of the apostolic group, and he was a very efficient organizer of the play life and recreational activities of the 12. Simon's strength was his inspirational loyalty. When the apostles found a man or woman who floundered in indecision about entering the kingdom, they would send for Simon. It usually required only 15 minutes for this enthusiastic advocate of salvation through faith in God to settle all doubts and remove all indecision, to see a new soul born into the liberty of faith and the joy of salvation. Although Simon was a rabid revolutionist, a fearless firebrand of agitation, he gradually subdued his fiery nature until he became a powerful and effective preacher of peace on earth and goodwill among men. Simon was a great debater. He did like to argue, and when it came to dealing with the legalistic minds of the educated Jews or the intellectual quibblings of the Greeks, the task was always assigned to Simon. Jesus was not afraid to identify himself with businessmen, laboring men, optimists, pessimists, philosophers, skeptics, publicans, politicians, and patriots. He went to Alexandria and, after working up the Nile, penetrated into the heart of Africa, everywhere preaching the gospel of Jesus and baptizing believers. Thus he labored until he was an old man and feeble, and he died and was buried in the heart of Africa. Thank you, Callie, for being my associate. I desire to close this podcast with some words to each of you who left such positive comments. Thank you for sharing your insights and encouragement. Share with me your thoughts about the 5 questions Jesus asked the 10 apostles as he walked with them on the beach. Aloha nui loa.